got quite a lot of people tonight, right? And now we'll do the screen share, share screen, and without losing it in the way I used to do it. Share, right. Right, this is the 26th Academia Bessarion, which began during COVID as a way of continuing discussions. Nick Peters is joining us now from Belgium. And tonight is going to be on a life in books. And I have remembered to record, and let's see if I can get the slides to move. This is always a problem. Right, I have just finished this book on Dante. It's at the publishers, and I'm hoping they accept it. And it has these chapters, and the title is Di questa commedia, lettor ti giuro, study on Dante, and it will talk about the ways in which he uses reality and allegory together, mixing them, and will end with a chapter on Dante's decolonialism. And I've really enjoyed writing this book. It sort of grew out of the Brunetta Latino materials. And then this is just about to be published by Le Lettere, it's O Bella Libertà, La Poesia di Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and it's edited by Rita Severi. She's the professor in Verona, and myself, with many other people translating the poems and Italians. And the cover I'm rather annoyed about because it's too genteel. It's all grey. I would have liked it to be a bit of a shock. Certainly the Aurora is, and so on. And I also do not like the sonnet they chose. I mean, everyone loves this sonnet. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. But it ended up not being a good marriage. And her other sonnets are more brilliant. You remember there's another sonnet by Shakespeare. They always read these two at weddings. Let us not unto the marriage of true minds and so forth. I can't bear either of them. And at any rate, this is the Tesoro of Brunetta Latino, and this has just been published by the Regione. And I've given the hypothesis that possibly 4 of the manuscripts are in Dante's hand, and the others are one is possibly by Guido Cavalcanti, and the others by Francesco da Barberino, who was also their fellow student. And it did receive the MLA seal for a scholarly edition, and it comes with a DVD, which is much more complete than the printed book, because we couldn't afford to print the whole thing. And then In God's Image, Neuroscience and Theology. This is a book that just sort of just poured out from my fingers as I was writing it. And I loved doing it. And I've not published it with a publisher, but myself, and some versions of it are bound in William Morris type and with marble paper, and others are the scholarly ones with all of the footnotes and so forth. And then I've also done this book for the Swiss on their Swiss Protestant cemetery, with listing all of the Swiss burials and the Swiss tombs. Many of the tombs are lost, and describing which cantons they came from, using their archives, which are brilliant, which even give the mother's maiden name of the deceased person. So you can do feminine genealogy as well as masculine. And then accompanying it, I've done the DVD with the entire listing of all of the burials, English, Russian, American, and so forth. And the second to last chapter on the lost tombs, which are almost as many as the extant tombs. And among them is Horatio Nelson's half-sister, Emma Carey, and so forth, and the governess, Catherine McKinnon, to the Russian Tsar. She had come from the island of Mull. And the final chapter is on how the Roma restored the cemetery. And then this is a book which we are not publishing, and it's going to be, gone over by lawyers and so forth, but it's the complete account of the 4 children being taken by social assistants, trafficked because it's lucrative for them, from their parents, who fought the case all the way up through the Italian Supreme Court, the Corte di Cassazione, and where we then were going to go to Strasbourg, the Court of Human Rights. It's taken 8 years. The parents have only been allowed to see their children twice in those 8 years. And the problem is that with the Brexit and Russia, the European Court of Human Rights doesn't have money for doing the doesn't have the money to carry on the case. And this is what is illustrated in Richard Hildreth's book, The Slave, of the last daughter being taken by the slave catchers from her mother. This is what literally happened to these 4 children taken by the police and social assistants violently from the arms of their parents here in Florence 8 years ago. And we've also published Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw with the Trollope Society, and Frances Trollope is buried here. The cover shows a lynching. She had traveled up the Mississippi River, was horrified by what she saw before Queen Victoria was on the throne of the conditions of Black slaves in America, and wrote this novel against it. It's a wonderful novel, and both Richard Hildreth, who's buried here, and Frances Trollope, who's buried here, their novels were then copied by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and hers was published in 1851, and it was translated immediately into Italian and Romanian. And in Romania, it freed the Roma, who were slaves longer than were Blacks in America, from the Middle Ages, and they were the slaves of the monasteries and the nobles. And these are my restorers in the cemetery. Then Brunetto Latino, Oxford Bibliographies in Medieval Studies published this. It's an e-book rather than a printed book. And then I love this. This is Cristina da Pisano. She, as a young child, was taken by her father, who became astrologer to the King of France, from the Veneto. And she was given as a child the right to read all of the manuscripts in the King's library. And I find that women, if they're let loose in libraries, can become wonderful scholars without formal education. And she's an example of that. And then when she was left widowed, she had to support her child and her mother. She took to creating these gorgeous coffee table books, which she illustrated. She'd already read the classics, and she'd read Boccaccio, she'd read Dante, she'd read Brunetto Latino in the King's Library. And her first book was Le Chemin de Longitude, Il Camin di Lungo Studio, where she is the part of Dante, and the Sibyl is the part of Virgil. And in the medieval manuscripts, Dante is often in blue as the apprentice, and Virgil is in red. And here we see her in sort of blue-gray, and the Sibyl in pink. It's sort of evoking the manuscripts. And it's a lovely dream vision of playing off, a feminist playing off of Dante. And then we had also already translated with this team of translators, Rosalind Pio, Bruna Dell'Agnese, Assunta Dalloy, Anna Vincitorio, Le Finestre di Casa Guidi. And I was presenting this in Casa Guidi. It was just a thrill because the bells of the church opposite rang just as we were reading the lines serendipitously. And in the final second book, the little boy who's been born to her is standing there in the light of the windows. And we actually have this photograph of Pen Browning, her son, with her spaniel locks. She made him look like herself. He was her alter ego, male and healthy, when she was frail and feminine. And the attachment the two had was very strong. And when Penn grew up, an orphan from his mother at 12, he always honored her memory and also his father's, and bought Palazzo Rezzonico in Venice and completely restored it and so forth. And then we had also, I'm going backwards through my publications. This is Mary's diary, where it's an anthology of pilgrim and contemplative writings, and it's got two purposes. One is so that someone reading it might find their vocation for the religious life as a contemplative. The other is to teach languages, because we've given all of the texts in their original languages, but prefaced by the translations into both English and Italian, because so many of our figures were related to each other. William Fleet was here near Siena at Lecceto. He was from Cambridge, and he was deeply involved with Catherine of Siena and so on. Birgitta of Sweden, her nuns also found a convent, Zion Abbey in England and so on. So we were trying to show how these contemplatives, especially the women and the pilgrims, were influencing each other internationally. And we called the book Mary's Diary because when I stayed with Sister Anna Maria Reynolds, when we were editing Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and this was in Kilcullen, which is Bridget's place and her well in County Kildare, one of the Irish nuns said to me, and I was Anglican and these were Catholic nuns, she said to me, England is Mary's diary, and one day she must be given back to her. Now, my husband took my diary and got his PhD and left me to get mine, and I got mine earlier than his, with no money and his 3 sons. So in a sense, this is a title which refers to my own biography. And then I had this wonderful mad aunt who did brilliant research on lichens for vegetable dyeing. And this book, I put it on Academia Edu, and it's read all over the world on how to create these pigments for cloth from different, and you can make gorgeous purples. And this is what we realized, that quite a few of the purple gospels from antiquity would have been involving women doing lichen dyeing rather than the terribly expensive shellfish, which was used for the imperial purple of the emperors and so forth. And then this one, Julian Amongst the Books, her theological library, in which I was able to put together essays I had already written as chapters, and one of them is on the Jewish community in Norwich, of which about 96 converted to Catholicism. And the evidence is that both Adam Easton, who was a Norwich Benedictine who became cardinal, who supported Birgitta of Sweden, had complete knowledge of Hebrew, was translating the Hebrew Bible into Latin, a copy of which we've got lost. And also Julian is translating directly in this, because I was editing Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who had the knowledge of Hebrew and Greek. I had to teach myself those languages. And while I was editing Julian, suddenly the penny dropped. She's translating directly from the Hebrew into Middle English, 2 centuries before the King James Bible. So that's one of the chapters in that book. And then we also did this project, it's not a book, but concerts of the music of the Commedia. I mentioned to a group of Italian musicologists and music performers, early music performers, that the music of the Commedia that Dante mentions could be researched from the original manuscripts, which at first they said, oh no. And then they said, this is wonderful, the music is beautiful. And they did these concerts in O San Michele, Cologne, Graz, Avila, Ravenna, San Francesco, and in the Duomo in Florence, where I got to sit almost next to the Cardinal during the performance, the 2-hour performance. And then we also had done this book, White Silence, It's also in Italian, Bianco Silenzio. It's a complete catalogue, as I mentioned before, of the English cemetery. We don't have the funds to print it, but it is an ebook on the web. That's the tomb of Thomas Southwood Smith, who raised his granddaughter Octavia Hill, who founded National Trust and did slum housing improvement and so forth. And he is doing the same. Ages shall honor in their hearts enshrine thee, Southwood Smith, physician of mankind, bringer of light, health, and light, health into the home of happier years of the poor and so forth. And we do our alphabet school with the Roma by this statue if one of the participants has TB, because that is the best cure for TB rather than drugs and hospitals. And it's also very good advice against COVID. Right, and then we talk about this book. This is the translation of my pilgrimage book into Italian, where we reduced it from being about Dante, Langland and Chaucer to only being about Dante. But we were able to get that published with a wonderful friend who works on pilgrimage roads, De Strata Francigena, the pilgrimage from France to Rome and so forth. And then this was a bit unfortunate. One person wrote to me, she was needing to do a bibliography of Julian of Norwich. And she and I worked together, and I said to her, do not go to the Edwin Mellon Press. But she did. So it's a very, very expensive copy to buy. And also the cover is awful. So when my copy came, I simply took the cover off and rebound it because I couldn't bear it. And now the Julian of Norwich scholarship has exploded. So it's also a bit out of date by this point, although this was, let's see, I forget which date that was. And then I love this book where it's Anchoress and Cardinal, Julian of Norwich and Adam Easton. And on the cover, I've got Jerome and Eustachian. Jerome went off to translate the Bible in a cave in Bethlehem. And he couldn't have done it without the funding of two rich Roman ladies, Paula and Eustochian, who did the funding, also studied Hebrew to assist him, and were his secretaries. And without those two women, which today everyone has forgotten, the Vulgate Bible would not have come into existence. And I got castigated by a woman scholar who said, how dare you say that Jerome needed the assistance of women, because she hadn't got the point. And then I've also played a lot with doing handbound limited edition books. I began by doing Richard Scheck's The Knight's Book on his poems, which I did when I was in my convent, and also Terence Through Time, where my graduate students wrote brilliant essays on Terence, who was the Black African ex-slave, whose Latin was gorgeous, and whose plays, his comedies influenced Dante, Montaigne, Shakespeare, Molière, and so forth. And then in my convent, Rose Lloyds used to come and stay. She was gypsy, she'd been brought up in an orphanage, and she wrote her biography. It was absolutely wonderful, an English Rose. I submitted it to Virago, and they rejected it, saying it couldn't be true. Some person would not be able to write such good English. But actually in her orphanage, they were taught very well. The orphanage was very cruel, and she describes that. But she won a prize given to her by the Astronomer Royal, a copy of Lorna Doone, because she had written so well. And then we did before I published the edition, I had already tried out doing it, and I bound that myself. I made it in 7 copies. And then I also did a portfolio of all of these essays, which later on with the web became essays on the web. and they're related to Julian and other women contemplatives, and the continuation into the 17th century of like Bridget Moore and Barbara Constable and others and so forth. And then I also did limited editions set in William Morris typeface of Julian of Norwich, Showing of Love from the Westminster Manuscript, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets and Ballad. The ballad is her anti-slavery poem, and The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point, and another one on Julian on Prayer. And then for a young Italian architectural student, I did his thesis on William Morris and the typographical art was written like a thesis. And I said, no, you need to do it like a William Morris book. So I set it in his typeface, and it was lovely. And then this was a book that I began writing, and when I was engaged to my husband, he was very scornful of it. It was a sort of novel, autobiographical novel called Mosaic. And I'd eventually put it on the web. And I'd also gathered up my poems and put them on the web as poems, penny each, and they're illustrated. Then this is one that Alex loves, Collections by an English Nun in Exile. She spells collections that way. I found this manuscript in the Bibliothèque Mazarin, and I transcribed it, and it's lovely. It's a gathering of contemplative writings exactly 100 years later than Father Augustine Baker had been assisting the nuns acquire medieval contemplative texts in the 17th century, from the 14th century, and encouraging them to write contemplative materials in that style. And it also describes how the nuns defended these books because the monks wanted to take them away from them. And they actually formed a daughter house in Paris, fleeing from Cambrai to do that, and wrote into their foundation document that it was to preserve these books, including Julian of Norwich. And then I had also, when I first came to Italy, was fascinated by Santu Milta, and was studying all of her texts on, well, she was illiterate, but she was dictating to her nuns beautiful theology. And there's a wonderful polyptych of the scenes of her life, which are illustrated in this book. And I was going to the, I'm trying to remember what it's called. This is many volumes of saints' lives by the monks who were showing which parts of these saints' lives can't possibly be true, and the Bollandists and so on. And I was able to put this book together in both Italian, in English, and it was rather badly translated into Italian. They thought Julian was a man, and so forth. And this wonderful Leonardo of Sismel, he loved this book. And then we also did, sorry about this image not being very good, the quality. This was, instead of a huge edition of Julian, this was a paperback where I showed all of the different versions that she wrote during the stages of her life. And that was in modern English, which we translated. And then we also worked with Bruna dell'Agnese, translating Aurora Lee into Italian. And that was published by Le Lettere. We would sit at the kitchen table here. She would come from Milan, and Assunta and I would go over this text, getting it into Italian from the English. And then this is the magnum opus, the edition of all of the Julian manuscripts, which Claudia Leonardi published with Sismel. It took 5 years to get it published. It took 12 years to do this work, and working with the manuscripts in the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale, and in Westminster, and so forth. And it has the photographs of the manuscripts as well. And then this I loved. This was one evening in Boulder when I was the director of medieval studies with colleagues from history and art history and other disciplines. And one evening in the faculty club, we were discussing Apulaires, because some of them were Freemasons and so on. And the discussion just became absolutely wonderful. So we said, all right, we'll do a conference. So we did the conference and then we published the papers. And they're absolutely fascinating. One is on the Black Madonnas. I did one on the ass and the harp in Boethius and so forth. And I love doing that book because here is an African writer who is playing with classical, the Roman gods, but also at the same time the Egyptian ones, Isis and so forth. And then I was also doing Brunetto Latino, Il Tesoretto. I'd already done it years ago, but now it was being privately reprinted for Professor Francesco Mazzoni by the Biblioteca, the Lorenzian Library. And I did the transcription of it. And here you see the image of Brunetto giving to his student Francesco de Barberino. And next one, Jerusalem. This is one that Alex loves, and I love it too. It was a collection of essays, and what happened here was Anne's Press, the editor, John Hopper, and his publisher, they both loved it. So they didn't charge me to get it published. They did it for free. Not only that, but the editor, who is Jewish, loved the final essay describing my pilgrimage to Jerusalem and how the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims all were together and protecting each other in order to protect themselves, that he decided to really splurge on its cover, which I love, the red and the gold, because I also mentioned how Frazar presents to the King of England a book of his writings bound in red and gold. So the publisher picked up on that. And then St. Bride in her book, this is the third edition of that. This is Birgitta of Sweden's Revelations, translated from Latin and Middle English. And she was the splendid woman, Swedish, mother of many children, who bullied popes and emperors and kings. And if they didn't obey her, dreadful things happened, like Black Death and bells of St. Peter's melting with the lightning striking them and the Pope dying within days of that, as she had predicted would happen. But she never predicts them herself. She always says that Jesus and Mary have told her to say this. But she was preaching to all of Europe about peace, the same thing that Brunetto was doing. And there are these great books created during the Middle Ages. Hildegard von Bingen, Alfonso Savio, Brunetto Latino, Dante Alighieri, Christine de Pizan, Birgitta of Sweden, and so forth, Catherine of Siena, who are clearly trying to teach European politics with integrity, with ethics. And then this is the Julian Library portfolio. And this is Aurora Lee, which was, I went and signed this contract in full pre-Vatican II rig as an Anglican sister in Oxford with Christopher Ricks. And it grew out of my helping my father, who was trying to write a biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning while he had Parkinson's and was dying. And I kept saying we need to publish her poetry. There hadn't been an edition of her poetry since 1900. And so Penguin published it. I did the typesetting. I do the typesetting of almost all my books. And then there's Twice Told Tales. This was the book on Brunetto Latino, where I was able on the sabbatical year with a fellowship from the American Association of University Women to stay here in Florence and to explore the archives and the libraries and finding 10 documents written in Brunetto's hand. And that's the first edition of my aunt's book on the lichens. And then that's the first edition of the St. Bride and her book, which was a different publisher from Brill. from not from Brille, from oh, I forget which publisher it was. Okay, sorry. Well, I'll stop that. Okay, Beudel and Brewer. And then Peregrina Publishing, she was wonderful, but she was a dreadful proofreader. She's got tons of errors, which I'm very ashamed about. But this was a translation of the life of St. Birgitta I found in a manuscript written by Birger Gregerson and Thomas Gascoigne. And then this book got me into a lot of trouble. Equally in God's Image, Women in the Middle Ages. This I was writing in Boulder, and we were realizing that with the coming of the universities, which is a Greco-Arabic model, the status of women went downhill. We were excluded from the lecture halls in which theology was taught. So from the first centuries of Christianity, being the religion of women and slaves, it then became the religion of men in a hierarchy. And the Madonna Romanesque, she's seated on the throne of wisdom in the Roman toga like Helena, the empress mother of Constantine, and the baby is also in a toga like the baby Constantine. And then in the Gothic period, the Madonna becomes simpering, courting her child, who now is more powerful than she is. And the whole style changes. So we got that into this book in our essays. And Hans Kuhn read it and put into his book on Christianity this information about the changing status of women because of the introduction of the Greco-Arabic universities. And then this was my doctoral thesis at Berkeley on The Pilgrim in the Book, which I then revised. And it went into 3 editions. And it's on Dante, Langlet, and Chaucer and their use of pilgrimages. And this was, I loved it, at Princeton. It's wonderful, red-haired English scholar had me sign the contract written out on a meal ticket to do the bibliography of Brunetto Latino, which was extremely useful, but this is now very much outdated, and I try to keep it up to date, but I've recently stopped even trying because it's now exploding to the scholarship on the web. But it was so useful having done that bibliography. The librarian at Boulder was furious with me because I kept, making all of these requests, and she said to me, "But you can't do this. You're just a student." I said, "No, I'm a professor." And so we did manage to do it. And I'd already done the Tesoretto, the edition and translation of Brunetto's poem, which is copied by Dante. Begins with Brunetto lost in the wood after learning of the trauma of his exile from Florence, then meeting allegorical figures who teach him. And so I grew up in a house of writers. These are my father's books, and one of them is also written by my mother. There are 8 books, tragedy of Gandhi, Peasant and Prince, because my father had friends who were Rajas, and I was actually betrothed as a child, jokingly, to one of them. 2 Lives Converge, that was written with my mother, Sybil Bolton, in alternate chapters, a book on Christopher Wren, because he was an air raid warden on Fleet Street as a journalist and on St. Paul's Cathedral. And one night, a bomb actually fell through the dome in a parachute, but didn't explode. And then Living Peter is on Pope John the 23rd, and Roman century, Rome was capital of Italy from 1870 to 1970. And then these are the conferences I organized at Boulder and on Alfonso Savio, Terence Rutine, Apuleius and Chaucer. I find conferences become books. It's a wonderful way of doing it. And then we did also on Giant's Shoulders and so forth. And then when I came to Florence from 2001, we've been doing The City and the Book. and these would be on different subjects, the alphabet and the Bible. These are published at Aleph and Florian MS. The City and the Book 2, the manuscript in the miniature. These were Dante manuscripts. Also, Hildegard von Bingen has a gorgeous manuscript in Lucca. Egeria has a manuscript in Arezzo. So there are many manuscripts by women here in Tuscany of that period. City in Book 3 was on the English cemetery with the Cabinet of Jussieu. And then 4 was on Walter Savage Landor and Henry Savage Landor. 5 was the Americans in the Swiss and English cemetery. And at this point, I learned how to do conferences with almost no money at all. The first one had been very handsomely funded by the Casa di Risparmio, and the second, but not after that. And then we even did one in Carrow Abbey in Norwich, and I found that you could do that with just a few €100. And then Dante Vivo, which I did in the Accademia di Bellezza, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning and sculptors here. And then one in St. Cuthbert and Northumbrian monastics in the Monte Amiata. And then I also worked with new modes of publication. And many of these I use synesthesia, where you get the text, but you also click on the arrows, which my grandson taught me how to do. And you hear the reading, which I do, recorded. So there's one on Dante's Florence as a virtual guide to the English cemetery. Those are out. Dante Vivo gives you all of the Commedia with readings by, one of them is by the son of Contadini, who reads Dante Cantastoria. It's wonderful. And he was doing this as a therapy before he died. We managed to get the whole of the Commedia done in time. And the others are by the Dante scholars who read Dante like prose and are so dull. And then we also put the manuscript miniatures, the music, the Blake and Botticelli drawings and so forth. The Opere di Brunetto Latino is also on the web, as well as in DVD, because I do believe in open access and not being commercial. White Silence is on the web and also with oral readings. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, her poems, with also Walter Savage Landor. Francis Trollope, but I don't do the oral part of it. Hengus Horn, New Spirit of the Age, is really important because he writes about Thomas Southwood Smith, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Francis Trollope, William Wordsworth, so many of the people who are involved here. And then the other website, www.umilta.net, is for women contemplatives and medieval material, whereas that first website, Florian MS, is all connected with Florence. And there you've got Dream of the Rood, you've got all the Birgitta of Sweden's Revelationes in Latin, which the Swedish scholars gave me in CDs from their work before they published the edition. Julian of Norwich, Showing of Love, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and other poems which I read in Middle English, William Langland's Piers Plowman and so forth. And then there's a section called Olive Leaf, and this is on trauma healing, and which I feel is very much connected with these writers. And now in this section of the talk, I'm plagiarizing Cardinal Newman's account of his conversion, his title, Apologia Pro Vita Sua, while trying to puzzle out my life in all of its fractals. In particular, writing this current book on Dante, I'm thinking of how he defied Aristotle, who said the figure of the poet ought nowhere to appear in his poem, since Homer does not do so. Dante used the examples of Augustine in his Confessions and Boethius in his Consolation of Philosophy to justify his disobedience to Aristotle. And then Christine de Pizan included herself as a dreamer in her dream vision poem, including the story of her widowhood, her child whom she is raising to be page in England and so forth, squire. And so did many women mystics, either themselves writing themselves into their texts or having male scribes to do so. I love that both Teresa of Avila and Frederick Douglass included in their defiant titles that their books were written by themselves because they were forbidden to write for our books are our therapy from trauma, and for our freedom readers. And I love that title, which Dennis Looney gave, and so forth. So among my website materials is an ebook, The Sweet New Style, Brunetto Latino, Dante Alighieri, Geoffrey Chaucer. And these are the essays in it. And this is Thomas Chaucer, Chaucer's son, and so forth. And I'd earlier explained how Dante's Commedia is a confession manual where you have Dante, the author, in red, and this is true flesh, blood, and body outside of the poem. Okay, let's go back. And then the poem is a fiction where Dante is the apprentice in blue, and the dream fiction and so forth, and the teaching that's going on with the mind and the soul within the poem. And then that is meant to affect us outside of the poem everywhere in all time, as we are the freedom readers and so forth. And then I'm relating this also to myself, England, USA, Florence, all my exiles. As an author, this is the true part of me, this is my real biography. And then these books that I create are sort of fractals of that, where I'm seeing other images that reflect parts of my own essence, and that these are for everywhere, all time, where we are the freedom readers and so forth, beyond the work. Milton saying books are the soul. And also when I wrote Mosaic, I used this from Virginia Woolf's Writer's Diary. What sort of diary should I like mine to be? Something loosely knit and yet not slovenly, so elastic that it will embrace anything solemn, slight, or beautiful that comes to my mind. I should like it to resemble some deep old desk or capacious hold-all in which one flings a mass of odds and ends without looking them through. I should like to come back after a year or two and find that the collection had coalesced, as such deposits so mysteriously do, into a mold transparent enough to reflect the light of our life, and yet steady, tranquil compounds with the aloofness of a work of art. And then this, I ask that be, when I'm cremated, that this be given also. This is something I tore up when I was in Belmont, and my husband was always rejecting what I was writing. It's Mosaic, part of Mosaic. And there's my son's hair and blessed olive leaves from Gethsemane. And the story is Colin is struggling to get into his overalls. One foot goes through one sleeve hole. He is proud of this. Get dressed and go out. Richard puts on socks, shoes, and shirts, scattering and laughing. They run through the house, the doors slam, and they are gone, out in the oak trees, the wind and the hill. Jonathan begins to cry. He's fed spoonful by spoonful, dip, shovel, wipe, dip, shovel. He laughs too. In his playpen, he teases on his toy, and the kitten cries for milk. So mine is a story of exile, of exiles upon exiles. And that was also true of my parents. I was sent to America at 16 to help my brother stay at Shrewsbury, returned to England at 55. It was no longer my England, and I fled to Italy. And the writer's family. My father's father from Dublin came to Warwick to teach painting, finally married my beautiful grandmother, but died of tuberculosis when my father, the eldest child of 4, was 7. To help his brother go to Cambridge, my father left Oxford to become a journalist in Yorkshire in India. My father came to Italy in the 50s, dying in Rome, and is buried with our ancestor, Richard Rothwell, who painted the portrait of Mary Shelley. And then before I left Boulder, we did this exhibition called Wild Geese, a family of Anglo-Irish artists. And this is my grandfather's painting of my father as a druid sacrifice, a little boy. And this is his mother, my grandmother. And this was a great pageant they did at Warwick Castle. And here we see my father and my grandmother and so forth, and then again. And this is my grandfather's portrait of my father and my grandmother. And this is the house they lived in opposite the Earl of Leicester's hospital, which he painted, which was founded by the Earl of Leicester at the time of Queen Elizabeth for poor soldiers. And this is my aunt, two aunts and my father playing in the garden of the Quaker house where they were also living. And this is when the family, the orphan, my grandfather died. Derek, who became a dean of the Church of Ireland, Joyce, who became a professor in California, who was my godmother, which is why I came to California to study there at 16, and my father, and then my aunt who did the book on the lichen dyes. My mother was born in a tent in Natal, South Africa. My grandfather, who was a doctor, a military doctor, is buried there in his tin helmet he wore in the trenches, a DSO, Distinguished Service Order, a medical doctor in front desk dressing stations, dealing with the atrociously wounded and dying. He was buried twice when the trenches fell over with the bombing, and he wrote the great history of the Great War for Cambridge University. And this is my my mother's family. That's my grandmother being presented to the king in Dublin Castle. This is my son in Haworth Parsonage, which my great-grandfather bought for the nation, and the brass plaque is celebrating that. He was Sir James Roberts. And these are my parents, both writers, and this is the frontispiece of the book they dedicated to Julia, Two Lives Converge. An earlier one my father wrote was dedicated to Julian and his mother. I wasn't born yet. They didn't know I was going to be a girl, and he cried when I was born because of that. Maybe that's why I ended up editing Julian of Norwich, who is a woman. I was born in Devonshire Place, Wimpole Street, Marylebone, London, which is absolutely the right for Elizabeth Barrett Browning's the custodian of her tomb. And then we lived in Strand-on-the-Green in London, but in World War II, a parachute mine destroyed that house. And that's where we were. They were trying to destroy the bridge, but they never succeeded. They only destroyed it, all of the houses around it. But we had a house in the country in Sussex, and this is my mother with myself. This is myself and myself. And this is the house in the country, which was lovely. It was later than Doomsday, but earlier than Tudor. And this is the church where I was baptized, the Church of St. John the Baptist. This is during a bombing raid in Victoria Station, and my father, for safety, took us down into the basement. And there was a polystamp photography shop, so he had us pose for that to keep us occupied. And so there were these 100 photos of our portraits. And this is in the country where, with our foster parents, Mr. Beattie, who was a carpenter who taught me carpentry, Mrs. Beattie, they were from Scotland, but down in Sussex. They were a lovely couple, and my children also on a pony. And then my aunt in California at Mills College was studying art under Max Beckmann. And when she did this painting about the feeling of being in exile, he came to her and he said, "You will be a painter." And before that, she was resisting him and doing Rembrandtesque paintings like her father. Now, my father was bisexual, and I put this in about Hadrian Antinous. This is my father and his Italian friend Amato, and my son Richard. And this is my great grandson, and Luke. In this, both in San Marco Square in Venice. And then this is when my husband had a very serious breakdown, and we were up in the mountains and Sierra Mountains. Yes.
Beautiful.
Richard and Jonathan. And this is my father in Rome writing his books. And these are my children in Rome, Jonathan, Richard, and Colin. And this is us in Wales, in Conway Castle, Jonathan, Richard, Colin, and my two aunts. And this is the aunt who did the book on the lichen dying with Jonathan missing teeth. And this is the peace ribbon we did because they were making the nuclear bomb triggers outside Denver, Rocky Flats. And we created this ribbon that went around the whole plant. And mine is of the Bayeux tapestry, where the Norman soldiers are burning down the Saxon woman's house and she's fleeing with her child. And this is when I was a novice, an Anglican nun in the Breed Church, and you can see the Lord of the Manor, Breed Place. And this is at Taizé. And this is Phil Rotten had me come to Iceland in the year 1000. And we were staying in the house of Janos Christiansen, who's this wonderful Icelandic scholar, and his wife. And this is the library when we began it. I built these shelves, but they're not yet full of books. Now they are. That's about 22 years ago. And this is where my son came, Richard and Luke. And this is the library upstairs with all the books in Greek, Latin, and Italian. And downstairs with all of the other books and the cradle, because I believe you need to have live cradles in libraries. Remember that Eloise complained to Abelard, you cannot have cradles in libraries and distaffs and inkwells. I believe you can. So we have Roma babies here, we have illiterates, we have scholars from the Institute for Advanced Study. To me, this library is a dream. And this painting was done by a Norwegian artist who, in his art school, had only been taught how to paint black paintings about death. And he did this of the Giotto painting that had been in the Badia. And I taught him how to frame, how to stretch the canvas, because my aunt had taught me. We are a family of artists. And he gave it to me. His mother had breast cancer, and this was his therapy over that. And then this is a Roma family with a baby in the cradle. I absolutely love that photograph. And this is me with Luke, who ringing the cemetery bell. I'm my great grandson. And so this is how I've been talking about how writing books, you can go through trauma. But as Viktor Frankl explained, if you can create meaning in the face of trauma, you survive. So now we open this to everyone to comment and welcome everyone. And I hope it made some sense.
Bravo. Absolutely. Wow.
It's been a bit crazy, but at 85, I think now I've written almost all of the books I want to write.
I think there will be many. I think there will be a number to come, Julia.
I don't know.
I think if that presentation showed anything among the many things that it showed, and it's just so moving, this presentation, even though I know most of your books and know you, but is the fidelity with which you have housed the word, and of centuries and centuries in which people have not, and especially women had not, and that you have brought that back, and the fact that you live in the cemetery. One of the things I find always so moving is how you bring the books, a book or books that somebody had written in the cemetery.
Yes, it's a very bookish cemetery, yes.
And it's the opposite, it's, I think you're just one of the happiest people I've ever met, and you live in a cemetery, and so there is this delicious paradox, but your work is, each of these things is so meaningful. And I just want to say, like a little footnote, that I noticed that you mainly when you talk about where these books are, and they're in many places, you've kept it to Europe, but Harvard has so many of your books, and many other places. So you continue to reach all continents.
Yes, and it's interesting that on the web, with the websites, and also with Academia Edu, which the Italians use very well, you reach many more people than you do from books on library shelves. Because we are, as Marshall McLuhan was explaining, we are changing our whole mode of communication. But the problem is that so much of the present work on the web is rather ephemeral. It can easily be lost. And the British Library is trying to archive, and there is the Internet Archive. But for instance, who will go on paying my server when I'm buried here, and so forth.
There's a book right there. All that you've said in about 1 or 2 paragraphs. To me, could be your next book, the internet and impact.
Yes, yes. And Phil, Phil, I so want to thank you for Iceland. It was so wonderful.
Julia. Thank you for coming. Yeah.
And that was that was the money that I got from the Tesoretto. They gave me 1 million lira, which isn't very much money, but it paid the airfare to get to Iceland. And that was from Giovanni Gentile, who is descended from Giovanni Gentile, Mussolini's theoretician, who is actually a very brilliant scholar. And for the publication by Le Lettere, and Le Lettere is now publishing the Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Nick Peters, it was wonderful to have you here, and welcome. And we should have brought in more of pre-Raphaelites, perhaps. But before you came in, we were talking about the Companion of the Guild of St. George. And there is a Companion of the Guild of St. George in Delhi. And I was talking with Manu about the possibility of doing a city and book conference on India and Florence, because we've got the tomb of the Indian prince. We've got many Indian connections in the cemetery. And what is wonderful is this Companion of St. George in Delhi. He's sort of teaching Delhi about William Morris and John Ruskin, his concepts about beauty and work, and also classlessness, which is also very much there in Aurora Lee, and below all walls level as Jericho's, glass walls level, and so forth. Irena, can you video, or do you want to stay only as letter I?
I want to stay as letter I, because I'm afraid that I'm watching on the phone, and I'm afraid that my Zoom will go off because.
Okay, right. Don't worry. Yes.
Yeah.
Can you?
I'm here. And
before your
sorry?
Zoom gets off.
No, I found things really interesting, especially when you were talking about Egeria and about these 2 women who were helping Saint Jerome, because it is something that is very close to my heart. I know that probably you've heard of Julie's recent compilation of articles, Thanks for Typing.
Right, I'm in it. I'm the one that does murder.
Yes, of course.
Yes, I wrote an essay in it on how Robert Browning murdered Elizabeth Barrett Browning.
Yes,
that's
I
right.
remember this one.
Oh, right, but it's a fascinating collection that Juliana Dresdiner got in touch with years ago from Moscow, and she had a very slow dial-up from Moscow, and she was working on Julian of Norwich in Russia. And then she came to Oxford to study here, and I used to help her with her English in the beginning, and now she's absolutely fluent. She says I'm her fairy godmother.
Oh, she has every right to, and it was her who introduced me to you, I think, when I was doing some work on Walter Savage Landor.
Right, yes. Yes.
It looks to me that we need another Thanks for Typing number 2, because it looks like we by no means have exhausted the number of characters subject.
Yes.
And I was thinking that this could be something for the next compilation of articles. I also did my own, I also contributed my own, which was about Judith Leister and this artist woman. who also fell into obscurity after she got married. You know, typical. So, you know, it was just, I found also your references to various websites quite useful.
Good.
I hope you might publish them because I didn't manage to make a photo of them. I'm sorry.
It's going to be recorded. I mean, it is recording, and so I will publish it almost immediately afterwards. So then I've got to do a version of this in Italian. That's always, I
Oh,
always
dear.
get very nervous when I have to present in Italian, but I have done that. Right. So all of this material is available, and both websites, if you scroll down, you'll come to a Google box, which is site specific. So you can type in what you want to find, and it will tell you where you will find that material. And so it has its own index. And Laura, did you want to say something? Do you want to unmute?
I was with Julia about a month ago and we had a lot of fun. I got to go on the Dante walk with her and look
Right,
at the
she was my
cemetery.
guinea pig, and because we'd done
Yeah.
mapping of Florence with the app, with the information of his biography mapped out in the spaces, and I've discovered so much material that the scholars hadn't seemed to have known about. For instance, the column in the Piazza Santa Felicita, which is illustrated in Francesca de Barberina's version of the Tesoretto, where 1,000 young Florentines, all dressed in white, came on St. John's Day in 1283 to worship the god of love. And then Dante that year is 18, and he says in the Vita Nova that he sees Beatrice in white. So you've got the physical space in which this happened, which I'm sure that the pre-Raphaelites would have absolutely loved because it's, you know, such a combination of everything.
Well, that part of your website, Julia, how do people find that part of your website?
Okay,
where you have
go to Florin MS and you can just Google florin.ms. MS is for manuscript. And then at the top, you will see a virtual guide, Dante's Florence. And click on that, and that will give you the app for exploring Dante's Florence.
Right, but you don't have to be in Florence to take the Dante walk.
But you can do it virtually. You can do it virtually.
You can do it virtually, and she has hypertext to the music, the artwork,
the readings, the map, and the photographs of the places, and it's all there.
So you'd probably be better to do all of that before you ever get to Florence.
That's right.
And then
to prep.
talk Julia, then talk Julia into taking the walk with you.
Right.
But I also, since I got back, Julia, I was given by a friend a book that Ross King just wrote called The Bookseller of Florence.
Ah, yes. Mm-hmm.
Has anyone seen that book yet?
No.
Yes.
It's just wonderful. And because the Airbnb where I stayed was just on the Borgo dei Greci, just near Via del Proconsolo, near the Badia and the Bargello, and this bookshop was right there. I'm loving it because it's the history of how books were made and how these scribes were being enlisted to copy classical text.
Which is what Francesca de Barberina was doing, yes.
All this beautiful information, and my most favorite quote from the book is a recipe for black ink, talking about the galls from the oak trees and the pomegranate rind, and this whole sequence that you go through that takes days of letting it sit and stirring it and adding Roman vitriol and stirring it and leaving it, and then when you finally get to the point where you're going to heat it up, you heat it and you stir it for the space of one miserere.
Yes, I love that.
In other words, how long it would take you to say the 19 verses of Psalm 51. I just love that. No oven timers, no cell phone clocks, stir it and say the Miserere out loud.
Yes, yes.
You know, like washing our hands, saying singing happy birthday, whatever. It's just this
Right.
wonderful image
One
of
that
life
I
back
really,
then.
really sure is sought out, so forth, which is what I was
Anyway,
doing when I was washing my hands. Right. Very good.
but Julia, you're doing the same thing this
Mhm.
Vapaisiano was doing,
Right.
because we're at the center of so many different cultures coming together. And
Mhm.
Bessarion figures very largely in this book, Cardinal Bessarion.
Yes. Oh,
The-
very
the one
good.
who made this
Excellent.
after. Yeah,
Because
he's
his
in
whole
there.
academia is named after him. That's wonderful. I
Right.
must
So
read it.
I learned a lot more about his role from the
Mhm.
book, and
Yes.
also about how all the Greeks showed up in Florence and
Right.
what they
Mhm.
brought with them.
Yes.
It's fascinating.
Mhm.
So
Excellent.
I'm really enjoying it.
Yes, that sounds wonderful. That's an excellent book review. Thank you. Manu, could you unmute and make some comments? No, silent. Okay. Marie Summers, could you unmute and make some comments? Marie, can
He
you
unmuted.
have your video?
Um,
Yes. Marie's
Thank you so
husband is
much.
a wonderful computer expert. Can you speak or not? Manu? Okay. The rest of us, are there any more comments from the rest of us?
Well, Julia, just being a psychology major, I can't help but add that I was very intrigued by your observation of writing a book as being cathartic, because I very much agree with you on that. And I wish that more people realize that. There are a lot of books in all of us, but it's a daunting task, to do that. But it is indeed cathartic. So that impressed me that you wrote, or that you said that, and just how you felt, as well as the cradles in the library. That was impactful.
Right. Yes, we call our project from graves to cradles, and I've actually also made a coffin, and, which is now on
there you go. There's life.
Yes,
so.
I mean, you do need those bookends to a life, and they are shaped out of organic materials of wood, to the conforming to the growth of the human body and so forth. This is nature. This is not, something that's artificial. But also, when you were mentioning that, I was remembering when I was an undergraduate at San Jose State, before going to Berkeley, before marrying. One of my first papers in the English department, I was only 17, was on Joseph Conrad, where I was seeing his being Polish and seeming to betray his country. And then this becomes a theme in Lord Jim and so forth. It was funny enough to make the angels weep and so on. I do feel that we write our lives into our books, and we're not meant to, in the scholarly world, you're meant to be the detached observer in the white lab coat and so on. But I kept noticing amongst scholars, that here I am, my father wanted me to be Julian, and I end up writing on Julian of Norwich after having resisted her, because there was a phase in my life when I just despised anything by women, thinking that we were inferior, I'd interiorized it. Then I had to overcome that. But I can remember finding someone writing on Jerome, Frenchman, whose name was Jerome, and so forth, that we do mirror ourselves into our work, even if we think we are not meant to. And I think it's probably better. Is there somebody in the waiting room? Christine, admit. Yes, Christine, can you manage to come in, joining? And who is Christine? Right, we've got another person. Christine, can you identify yourself? Ask to unmute. Okay. And which Christine are you? Right, welcome.
Hello.
Come
Thank
at
you
the
very much for letting me in. Thank you.
Right.
My name is Christina Latek. I met you a few years ago in Florence in your wonderful library. And so I was really looking for, I'm really sorry I couldn't get here earlier. I was
But you're very
domestic
welcome
barriers.
now. We're sort of ending up,
Thank you.
but it's going to be recorded. It is being recorded. And so if you're on Facebook, and you can find me on Facebook, it'll probably be www.florin.ms/Bessarion26.mp4. So it'll be there on the web. And your field is?
My own field is 19th century history.
Yes.
So it's unrelated, but I'm very interested in your work. I think you have such an amazing collection of topics. So
Yes.
So you've been exploring in the Bessarion, yes.
It's more of a hobby, yeah, than an actual.
Okay, good,
yeah,
good
work.
Yes, it's been fun doing it. In a way, Milton has an expression: precious bane is something that is good and evil together, and this has been sort of precious bane from COVID, figuring out how to do these international gatherings on Zoom and so forth. And we've even been doing Quaker meetings and silence on Zoom, which is quite interesting, with Quakers all over Italy, and also some participants come from England. Manu, you have not made any comments, and I would love it if you did, even if it's scathing.
Oh.
No, he's not unmuting, right? But he's still obviously present and listening. So I think we're also
Julia, may I ask you
yeah?
a question? Sorry to interrupt you.
Who's speaking? Yes.
You were saying at some point that you interiorized this. You managed to overcome it, and how long did it take you to finally get over it?
I didn't quite catch that. I'm hearing impaired, so I do a lot of lip reading. But if you could repeat the question.
Okay, I'll try to.
Thank you.
Yes, we have some sound jamming tonight. I can also perhaps try to. Can you see
Right.
now?
Yes, I know that
That's me.
Okay, right.
This sense of inferiority, imposed inferiority, that women are somehow worse academically and intellectually. And how long did it take you to overcome this? The
sense of inferiority. Well, I think at first it was, that any decent scholar, bless you for being visible, and I used to feel that any decent scholarship had to only be male only, and because actually, with feminism, we sort of turned ourselves into men, didn't we, for a long time, and we sort of entered into the male world, and then I realized that this is part of our rejection of our being women, and that we don't need to reject that. And that's why I found it was wonderful when I discovered the women and began writing on them instead of only men. And that became the point where I was accepting myself. Does that make sense? But I found it was really satisfying realizing how brilliant women are. Because, I think we have a lot of self-doubt about ourselves. I was very leery about doing this talk, and I had originally sort of sketched it out as an autobiography, and then I backed out from it. And then just on Sunday evening, I realized I could do it through the books. And it was also the point where I was being attacked and was in real jeopardy. And I realized if I could actually present to myself what I've been capable of, that would give me a little bit more stamina, if that makes sense.
I hope you watch this recording, Julia, because of what you just said is so true. I mean, I am, so glad that you did today. So glad, but I hope you watch yourself on this because it's quite powerful what you presented today, and to take it in yourself. Really, bravo. It was just wonderful.
Thank you very much. I just wish that Manu would participate.
Thank you very much for your answer. It's very encouraging.
Thank you. Right. So now I will say good night, ladies, and also gentlemen, and how very grateful I am to all of you. And so good night.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Julia.
you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Good night.
Thank you,
Good
Julia.
night.
Thank you. Thank